The badge lay on the wooden porch like it had fallen from the sky, catching the pale orange glow of the setting sun. A small piece of silver shining against the old boards worn smooth by years of boots and storms, and beside it rested a folded letter, its edges lifting slightly in the warm desert wind, as if it were breathing, waiting, hoping to be opened. Clara Whitmore noticed it the moment she stepped out of her little ranch house with a bucket of feed in her hand, her boots stopping mid-step, her breath tightening in her chest, because she knew that badge better than she knew the lines on her own hands. It belonged to the only man who had ever made her heart forget how to be careful, Sheriff Daniel Hayes. The ranch stood alone on the edge of Dry Creek Valley, where the land stretched wide and quiet, and every sunset looked like a painting made of dust and fire. Clara had lived there most of her life, running horses and keeping the place standing long after her father passed on. Folks in town said she was the toughest woman for 50 miles, but they also knew there was one name that could soften her voice: Daniel Hayes, the lawman who rode into town 5 years ago with a steady gaze and a past nobody could quite piece together. A man who carried justice on his hip and loneliness in his shadow. Clara set the bucket down slowly, the grain inside settling with a soft rustle, and she stepped toward the porch rail where the badge rested, the silver star glinting like a stubborn memory. Her fingers hovered over it for a long moment before she picked it up. The metal felt warm from the sun, heavier than it looked, heavier than it should have been, and that was when she noticed the letter tucked beneath it, her name written in Daniel's careful handwriting across the front, each letter strong and deliberate, the way he did everything. She opened the letter slowly, the paper crackling under her fingers, the wind tugging at her hair as she unfolded it, and the first line made her heart skip so hard she had to grip the porch rail. Clara, it began, simple and steady, just like the man who wrote it. By the time you read this, I'll already be gone. Her eyes moved over the rest of the words with a mix of dread and hope twisting inside her chest, because Daniel Hayes had never been a man who left without a reason, and he sure as hell wasn't a man who left his badge behind. She read the letter twice before the meaning truly settled in. Daniel had stepped down as sheriff, not because he was tired of the job, and not because he had failed at it, but because something bigger had come calling. Trouble from his past had found its way back to Dry Creek, the kind of trouble that followed men across states and across years. He wrote that he wouldn't risk bringing it to her doorstep, not when he cared for her more than he had ever admitted out loud. And at the bottom of the letter was the line that made Clara's chest ache: I left the badge because the law belongs here, but my heart belongs with you, and it always has. The valley felt strangely quiet after she finished reading. Even the wind seemed to slow down, as if the land itself was thinking about what had just happened. Clara leaned against the porch post and stared at the dusty trail leading to Wartown, trying to imagine Daniel riding away sometime earlier that morning, his tall frame in the saddle, his coat flapping in the breeze, the same way it had every time he came to see her, except this time he hadn't knocked on the door, hadn't tipped his hat, hadn't said goodbye. Clara had known Daniel Hayes long enough to understand that silence usually meant danger. He had told her once about the years before he became sheriff, years spent chasing outlaws and crossing borders where the law held less weight than a loaded revolver. He never said much about the enemies he made back then, but she could see it sometimes in the way his eyes scanned a room, or how his hand rested near his gun when a stranger rode into town. Whatever had come looking for him now must have been big enough to make him walk away from the badge he wore like a second skin. Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket, the silver badge still resting in her palm, warm and solid, proof that Daniel Hayes had been here not long ago. She looked out across the fading horizon where the last of the sunlight painted the hills in gold and red, and a quiet determination settled into her bones. Because if Daniel thought he could disappear into the wild without a word and leave her behind with nothing but a badge and a letter, then he had forgotten one important thing about Clara Whitmore. She wasn't the kind of woman who waited on the porch. She was the kind who saddled her horse and rode after the truth. The moon had barely climbed over the Dry Creek hills when Clara Whitmore stepped back onto her porch with purpose, burning in her chest, the silver badge of Sheriff Daniel Hayes resting heavy in her hand like a promise that refused to be ignored. The valley air smelled of dust and sagebrush and the distant whisper of cattle shifting in the dark. But Clara wasn't listening to the quiet of the ranch anymore. She was listening to the echo of hoofbeats that had already faded down the trail hours earlier, because somewhere beyond those hills rode a man who thought leaving a badge and a letter could settle the matter of a heart that had never learned how to stay still. Inside the barn, lantern light flickered across the rough wooden walls while Clara saddled her best horse, a tall chestnut mare named Ruby, who had carried her across half the county more times than anyone could count. The mare snorted softly as Clara tightened the saddle strap, sensing the urgency in her hands. Clara slipped Daniel's badge into the inside pocket of her coat and tucked the folded letter beside it, close enough to feel with every breath she took. Then she grabbed her father's old revolver from the shelf, spun the cylinder once out of habit, and holstered it at her hip, because if Daniel Hayes had ridden away from town to face trouble, then she figured trouble might be waiting somewhere along the road. The trail into Dry Creek Town wound through low hills painted silver by moonlight, the same road Daniel had ridden hundreds of times as sheriff. Clara could picture him clearly in her mind, tall in the saddle, hat pulled low, his quiet voice calming a bar fight or settling a dispute between ranchers before it turned ugly. Folks trusted Daniel Hayes because he never raised his voice and never pulled his gun unless he had no other choice. But Clara knew another side of him too. The man who would sit on her porch after a long day and talk about nothing at all while the stars came out one by one above the valley. By the time Clara reached the edge of town, the lanterns in the saloon were still burning bright, laughter drifting through the night air along with the familiar piano tune played by old Walter Briggs. She tied Ruby outside and stepped onto the boardwalk, her boots thudding softly against the wood. A few heads turned when she pushed open the swinging doors of the Dusty Spur Saloon, because Clara Whitmore wasn't known for late-night visits to town unless something serious was brewing. Inside the saloon, the smell of whiskey and tobacco hung thick in the air. Cowhands leaned against the bar, and poker players paused mid-hand when they saw the determined look on Clara's face. Behind the counter stood Jonah Price, the broad-shouldered bartender who had known Daniel since the day he first rode into Dry Creek. Jonah wiped a glass with a rag and raised an eyebrow the moment Clara walked up to the bar. "Evening, Clara," he said slowly. "You look like someone who's got a storm on her mind." Clara didn't waste time with small talk. She placed Daniel's badge on the bar between them and asked the one question that had been burning inside her chest since sunset. "When did he leave?" Jonah's eyes dropped to the badge, and the easy smile he usually carried faded into something quieter, something thoughtful. He leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice so the rest of the room couldn't hear. "Daniel came through here early this morning," he said. "Didn't stay long. Just had one cup of coffee and asked if anyone strange had been passing through town lately." Clara felt her stomach tighten at the words, because that sounded exactly like Daniel, always looking 3 steps ahead of whatever danger might be walking behind him. Jonah set the glass down and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly weighing how much to say. "Couple riders came through yesterday afternoon," he continued after a moment. "Didn't give their names, didn't stay long either, but they were asking questions about the sheriff, about where he might be found. One of them had a scar down the side of his face like a lightning strike." Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the bar, because she could see the answer forming before Jonah even finished the story. Whoever those riders were, Daniel had known exactly what they meant. Clara picked up the silver badge and slid it back into her pocket, the cool metal pressing against her heart as she turned toward the saloon doors again. Jonah called after her quietly, "Clara, wherever he's headed, it ain't gonna be safe." She paused for just a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe while the piano music drifted through the room behind her. Then she spoke without turning around, her voice calm and steady as the desert night. "Jonah, the man left me a badge and a letter saying he's mine." She pushed the door open and stepped back into the moonlit street. "And I don't aim to let him ride into trouble thinking he has to face it alone." The sun was just beginning to rise when Clara Whitmore rode out of Dry Creek, the pale light stretching across the desert like a slow-moving river of gold. Ruby's hooves beat steadily against the dirt road, while the valley behind her faded into silence. Clara had spent most of the night thinking about Jonah's words and the riders with the scar-faced man asking questions about Daniel Hayes, and the more she thought about it, the clearer the trail became in her mind, because Daniel had always followed one rule when danger came knocking. He met it before it could reach the people he cared about. The land beyond Dry Creek rolled into long empty plains, where wind pushed dust across the ground in restless waves. Clara rode for hours with the sun climbing higher over the hills, and every mile made the weight of Daniel's badge feel heavier in her coat pocket. She kept replaying the letter in her mind, the careful handwriting, the line that said his heart belonged to her, and the quiet goodbye hidden between the words. But Clara Whitmore had never been good at accepting quiet endings, not when the story still had a road left to travel. By midday she reached a narrow canyon known as Red Hollow, a place where the cliffs rose tall and jagged on both sides of the trail, the kind of place where riders could disappear without leaving much behind. Clara slowed Ruby to a careful walk as she studied the ground, and it didn't take long before she saw them, fresh hoofprints cutting across the dust. At least 3 horses had passed through recently, maybe 4, the tracks twisting toward the deeper part of the canyon like a trail leading straight into trouble. Clara dismounted and tied Ruby to a low branch before continuing on foot. The canyon walls held the heat of the sun, and the silence inside them felt heavy and watchful. Every step echoed softly against the rock, and then she heard something that made her heart jump, the sound of voices, low and rough. Drifting through the narrow passage ahead, Clara moved closer, keeping to the shadows until the scene unfolded in front of her, like a moment frozen in time. Daniel Hayes stood in the center of the canyon clearing, with his hands resting near his revolver, his coat dusty from the road, and his hat casting a shadow across his calm eyes. 3 men surrounded him with guns drawn, one of them tall and thin with a jagged scar running down the side of his face, the very man Jonah had described the night before. And even from a distance Clara could see that Daniel looked exactly the way he always did when trouble showed its teeth. Steady, quiet, and unafraid. Thought you could ride away from old debts. Hayes, the scar-faced man, sneered, his voice sharp against the canyon walls. But some things follow a man wherever he goes. Daniel didn't move, didn't even raise his voice when he answered. That's why I came here, he said calmly. Figured it was better to settle it somewhere far from town. The men laughed, their guns still pointed at him, but Clara noticed something they didn't. Daniel's stance wasn't one of surrender. It was the stance of a man waiting for the right moment. Before the tension could snap any tighter, Clara stepped out from the shadow of the canyon wall, her revolver drawn and steady in her hand. Looks like you boys miscounted, she said firmly, her voice echoing through the hollow. Every head turned toward her in surprise, including Daniel's. And for the first time since she had found the badge on her porch, she saw something break through his calm expression. A flash of disbelief followed quickly by concern. Clara, he said under his breath, like her name was both a miracle and a warning at the same time. The moment that followed moved faster than the wind that raced through the canyon. The scar-faced outlaw swung his gun toward Clara, but Daniel was quicker. 2 sharp shots cracked through the air, and the fight was over almost as soon as it began. Dust drifted slowly back to the ground, while the remaining outlaws scrambled away down the trail. Leaving the canyon quiet once again, Clara lowered her revolver and walked toward Daniel, pulling the silver badge from her coat pocket and pressing it into his hand. Her voice softer now, but just as steady. You left this on my porch like you were ridden out of my life, she said, and Daniel looked down at the badge before meeting her eyes again, the same warm honesty shining there that had always been impossible to ignore. He closed his fingers around her hand instead of the badge and gave a small, tired smile. No, he said gently, I left it there because I figured once this was done, I'd come back and ask if you'd have me, not as your sheriff. He paused, his voice turning quiet with something deeper than courage. But as the man who already wrote you that letter saying he's yours.